Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster just told me they're coming to smear Rebel News. This morning, they contacted me telling me they were going to publish an attack on us at 12 noon Alberta time today. They say they have a secret letter written by me to the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, and that they're going to publish a story about that letter at 12 noon. And do I have any explanations for it? Wow. Well, what would you do if a government journalist from Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster was trying to blackmail you with a gotcha story? Well, I think you'd probably do the obvious. You would publish the letter yourself first so everyone could see it in full. You'd call the CBC's bluff. So that's what I'm doing. You can see my letter to Danielle Smith right now at a website we've set up called lockdownamnesty.com. It's a 5-page letter that I sent to the Premier's Chief of Staff back in November after I had a chat with her in person. And I want to let you know I am very proud of that letter, and I stand by every word of it, and I want you to read it at lockdownamnesty.com. Read the whole thing for yourself. It should come as no surprise that the CBC is coming to throw mud at Rebel News and me. They are Justin Trudeau's state broadcaster. They are his attack dogs, and they hate nothing more than Rebel News and the people who support us. They follow Justin Trudeau's lead.
Quite frankly, I won't call it a media organization, your group of individuals need to take accountability for some of the polarization that we're seeing in this country. And I think Canadians are cluing into the fact that there is a really important decision we take about the kind of country we want to see. And I salute all extraordinary, hardworking journalists that put science and facts at the heart of what they do and ask me tough questions every day, but make sure that they are educating and informing Canadians from a broad range of perspectives, which is the last thing that you guys do.
The CBC obeys Trudeau and copies him, so they smear us and they attack us. They're part of the parliamentary press gallery that has illegally voted to block our reporters from attending press conferences in Ottawa. That's how gross the CBC is. So the CBC has come for Rebel News now. They think this is their moment to hurt us. Now, when I got their letter this morning, I thought for a moment of writing back to the CBC smear merchants directly, but then I thought, why would I do that? Rebel News has far more viewers in Alberta than the CBC does. Why wouldn't I just make this video with their gotcha questions and my answers and send it out myself? At least that way I know that Trudeau's journalists won't tamper with what I say. Out of fairness, I'll read to you their entire letter to me. They would never give me that fairness. Their letter is from a wicked liar named Megan Grant. But first, let me tell you a little bit about what this is all about and why it's happening. See, when Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was first running for the leadership of the United Conservative Party a few months ago to succeed Jason Kenney, when she launched her campaign, our reporter, Adam Sose, asked her a great question that the CBC would never ask her. We asked if she would call off Jason Kenney's politically motivated lockdown prosecutions.
Meanwhile, though, we're still seeing targeted charges against pastors and small business owners. Some of these are being dropped, fortunately. Others are still clogging up the courts. Are you willing to commit to staying charges and freezing ongoing investigations against those emanating from the lockdown? And how do you plan to restore faith in the courts and in politics?
Yes, we have to. We never should have come down on pastors the way we did. Every other jurisdiction, it seems, were able to enforce their measures without putting pastors in jail, and it's created so much division in our communities. So yes, we should drop those. We should also drop charges against small businesses. Part of the reason why we're enjoying the freedoms that we have today and the ability to go and watch hockey games is because there were some courageous people who stood up and said, you know what, there's another way to do this. Enough is enough. It took the politicians a little while longer to realize that. But now that they've realized that, I think part of the healing process is to make sure that some of those charges are dropped. The other thing we need to do, though, is we need to have a full reckoning about what happened, who made the decisions, why they made the decisions that they did.
Great question and a great answer. It became part of her campaign platform. And right then, the CBC resolved that they would do anything in their power to destroy Danielle Smith. But they failed. She is now the Premier of Alberta, but the CBC knows they'll get another chance just 4 months from now in the general election, so they are campaigning against her full tilt. Anyways, it looks like Smith is serious about keeping her promise to call off these very political lockdown prosecutions. Here's Smith confirming her position when our reporter Selena Glass asked her about it in November.
During your campaign, you said that not only would you issue an apology to those prosecuted during COVID restrictions, but you would also grant them amnesty. When can we expect those apologies?
I can apologize right now. I'm deeply sorry for anyone who was inappropriately subjected to discrimination as a result of their vaccine status. I'm deeply sorry for any government employee that was fired from their job because of their vaccine status, and I welcome them back if they want to come back. As for the amnesty, I have to get some legal advice on that. So I've already asked my staff to request that advice so I can see how we would be able to proceed on that. My view has been that these were political decisions that were made, and so I think that they can be political decisions to offer a reversal. But I do want to get some legal advice on that first.
Would that also have to do with the timeline for the proposed amnesties?
I would have to see if I can do it, I will do it at the earliest opportunity. So I'm hoping within the next week I'll get that legal advice.
And at Christmas, I personally sat down for a one-on-one year-end interview with Premier Smith, and it was actually the main issue I asked her about. Now, I'm not going to play you the whole interview. We talked for almost half an hour. You can see that whole interview at lockdownamnesty.com if you want. We put the video there. But here's just a taste of it. The world has moved on, but Alberta Health and Alberta Justice are still prosecuting. And they haven't had a lot of wins, but they've had a few.
Yeah.
And it just feels like a hangover from a bygone era.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's in sync with the times. Is there a way to move on? It feels like a vendetta from some prosecutors that really want to punish these guys. That's how, now I'm coming from a very strong point of view. I support these guys.
Yeah.
And I know you've got to be, you can't meddle in a judicial process, but boy, it doesn't feel like it's in the public interest.
I think we learned a lot about how our justice system works in watching things at the federal level, and how the Attorney General and the Crown have an independence from the Premier's office. The questions that I can ask and have asked and continue to ask is it in the public interest?
Yeah.
And is there a reasonable likelihood of conviction?
Yeah.
And I think the longer that we go on seeing that prosecutions are not being successful, it makes a stronger case on both of those fronts. That if the conviction isn't likely, we know that we have a lot of pressure on our courts.
Yeah.
And if the public has now come to terms with wanting a different approach, is it in the public interest? It's becoming increasingly hard to answer those two questions. Now, I put it to the prosecutors, and I've asked them to do a review of the cases with those two things in mind.
Smith was very careful with her words, wasn't she? She said she wasn't going to interfere with any prosecutions. That's what Justin Trudeau did to save his corrupt friends at SNC-Lavalin. But Smith would follow the rules and just have a look at cases to make sure they were legally appropriate, especially since the province was losing so many of those cases in court. Were they really in the public interest to pursue? Did they really have a chance of conviction? Well, the government journalists at Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster couldn't stand that. And they hunted and hunted for proof that someone did something wrong. They showed a passion for this story that they never showed for Trudeau's interference with the SNC-Lavalin case. And huge scoop, they found the smoking gun. Here's the blockbuster story that Megan, the CBC liar, published last week. Let me show it to you on Twitter. New. Alberta Premier's office contacted Crown prosecution about Coots cases. Sources. Coots is some of the trucker cases. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but more than 500,000 people read that tweet. And if you click on it, it leads to this story that is still up on the CBC website right now. Alberta Premier's office contacted Crown prosecution about Coots cases. Sources. Now I'll read just a little bit from the story. A staffer in Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's office sent a series of emails to the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service challenging prosecutors' assessment and direction on cases stemming from the Coutts border blockades and protests, CBC News has learned. The emails were sent last fall, according to sources whom CBC has agreed not to identify because they fear they could lose their jobs. Wow, that is a bombshell. That's amazing investigative journalism. It's a smoking gun. In fact, it was so devastating it caused an emergency caucus meeting in Alberta. Smith's MLAs were in open revolt. Except it wasn't true. There were no such emails. And the CBC didn't admit until days later that they actually never saw any such emails. They didn't disclose that in their original story because they're not real journalists. They're government journalists. That's a very different thing you have to understand. They work for Trudeau. But because of that false accusation, the Public Service of Alberta, the nonpartisan permanent staff of the government, they had an emergency search of every single email between the Premier's entire staff and the Justice Department. They literally reviewed 1 million emails. And there wasn't a single one. Not one. Here's a CBC story grudgingly admitting that. Nearly a week after their smear was first published. You can see this was written by a different CBC reporter. Megan Grant is still lying about things. Her lie is still being published, both the tweet and the story that I showed you. They're still up. All they've done is added this little note to it. They say, editor's note. The original version of the story, published January 19th, neglected to note that CBC News has not seen the emails in question. Seriously, they left that out? They didn't mention that when they first made the accusation? They didn't admit they actually hadn't seen any proof. They smeared the entire government, not to mention the prosecutors. They tried to cause a caucus revolt, and they actually hadn't seen the emails they claimed existed and that we now know do not exist. How is that story even still online? How are they still broadcasting that? How is that headline even still there? How is that wicked liar, that fabricator, that hoaxer, that disinformation spreader, that Trudeau shill Megan Grant, how is she even still employed there? Well, because lying to Albertans and lying about Albertans is a key requirement to work for Trudeau CBC. Duh. Remember this other CBC liar lying about the trucker convoy?
You know, given Canada's support of Ukraine in this current crisis with Russia, I don't know if it's far-fetched to ask, but there is concern that Russian actors could be continuing to fuel things as this protest grows, but perhaps even instigating it from the outset.
She actually got a raise and a promotion after that lie because it pleased Justin Trudeau. I bet Megan Grant got an attagirl call from the PMO too. So the CBC just blew up whatever credibility they had left in Alberta. I mean, not that they had any. I mean, they really hit rock bottom such a long time ago, but they're still digging. But Megan Grant is now trying in some way to salvage her credibility. So she sent me this letter this morning, and I'm going to read it to you. And you can see it in full at our special website, lockdownamnesty.com. Here's what the liar Megan Grant said to me. Hi, Ezra. My colleagues and I are working on a story about the Premier putting pressure on the Justice Minister in an effort to get COVID-related charges dropped, especially Arthur Pawlowski's. We have an email dated October 25 sent from you to the Premier's office following an in-person meeting which took place at the UCP convention days earlier. The email advocates for nonviolent COVID-related charges to be stayed or withdrawn and advises the Premier on how she could make that happen. The email makes the case for why some charges should be dropped and why the Attorney General should intervene. My questions for you are, what prompted you to send that email? What influence do you feel your advocacy has had on these types of cases? Do you wish to add further comment on these matters? We plan to publish at noon. Many thanks, Megan Grant. So now she's trying to imply that in some way Rebel News has done something wrong, or that I have, or that we have somehow counseled the Premier to do something wrong. It's a gotcha. And she says I only have a few hours to reply, or she's going to leak my letter. So I'm going to leak it first at lockdownamnesty.com. You know, Rebel News and I have been saying the same thing about these lockdown prosecutions in public and in private to anyone who would listen for nearly 3 years, including at Smith's annual general meeting and in my year-end interview with Smith. You might even know we literally have a billboard at the side of the main highway in Alberta calling on Smith to drop the prosecutions. It's called Lockdown Amnesty. Here's an excerpt from my 5-page letter, the one that the CBC thinks is a smoking gun. It is 5 pages with legal footnotes. There's a lot of legalese in them. So I won't read the whole thing to you, but here's part of it. I just want to give you a flavor of this letter. I am only suggesting that the prosecutions, which have been politically motivated, targeting people who only sought to exercise their constitutional freedom of expression and religion, be stayed or discontinued. From my knowledge of the prosecutions, most people charged were either attending a protest or a religious gathering. Usually the people charged were the low-hanging fruit, the most vocal, or the ones sharing their message on social media. None of the prosecutions that the Democracy Fund or Rebel News supports have any violence or firearms involved. The Premier's action on these prosecutions will promote democratic principles and ensure an appropriate use of our court's limited resources. You've heard me say that a dozen times before, including in my year-end interview with the Premier. The CBC somehow thinks this is a gotcha moment, but it just shows they only rebreathe their own air and listen to their own point of view. They never listen to any other voices, and they obviously don't watch my show, or they'd know what I said to the Premier herself in my year-end interview. Here's another excerpt from my letter. Really, go and read the whole thing at lockdownamnesty.com. I'm very proud of that letter, and I think you might enjoy it. You might learn something from it. I think it was a useful letter. Let me read some more. Withdrawing charges, staying proceedings, or declining to prosecute or continue a prosecution is justified if there is no reasonable likelihood of conviction. This standard varies by the facts of each case. Or if the prosecution does not serve the public interest. The prosecutions that I am aware of do not meet either element of the test, let alone both, so staying the charges is well justified. There are clear legal issues with many of the prosecutions that I am familiar with. Prosecutions under the Public Health Act are likely to fail because, as the Premier likely recalls, the Chief Medical Officer of Health orders were vague, confusing, inconsistent, and did not specifically prohibit certain activities, unquote. Okay, there's a little legalese in there, but I think you can get it. Last excerpt. I'm proud of this letter. I want you to read it. Quote, the Premier can, should she choose to, direct the Attorney General to review and withdraw or discontinue any cases arising from the Chief Medical Officer of Health orders under the Public Health Act, criminal charges being prosecuted by the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service, charges under the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, or any pending charges or applications stemming from alleged breaches of the court's orders to refrain from public gatherings or otherwise. The Premier could request that the review be undertaken with respect to each prosecution held with Alberta Crown Prosecution Service, and cases where there is no reasonable chance of conviction or where prosecution does not serve the public interest be discontinued immediately. Obviously, the Attorney General would take into account the Premier's view that without more, i.e. violence, proceeding with these prosecutions is not in the public interest, unquote. Look, I've said that in public, I've said that in private, I've said that to the previous government, I've said it to the current government. I said it to Danielle Smith in an interview, and I've said it to her in a private conversation, and I've said it to her in an amazing 5-page letter that you really should read for yourself. And that's what the CBC can't stand. They can't stand that Premier Danielle Smith would actually listen to another point of view besides Trudeau's point of view or the CBC's point of view. They can't stand that Premier Smith actually might care about freedom and think that bullying Christian pastors or, small restaurateurs or other peaceful protesters is not in the public interest. The CBC can't stand that Smith actually talks to me and gave me a great year-end interview, by the way. Look, I have no idea what Smith did or didn't do with the letter I wrote to her. I hope it was circulated, frankly. I'm just glad that she's interested in more points of view than the Trudeau shills at the CBC. And that's what the CBC hates. So that's why I'm not actually scared about the CBC leaking my letter, because they might think it's scandalous, but I am actually very proud of it. In fact, I would be grateful if you read it. And in fact, if you are an Albertan, I would encourage you to send a version of that letter to Smith yourself or to your local MLA. And while you're at that special website, lockdownamnesty.com, take a moment to sign our petition. I just checked, and nearly 25,000 people have signed it so far to call off these prosecutions. Let's see how high we can get that number. If you're like me and you despise the CBC and you're deeply embarrassed for the unethical journalism published by Megan Grant last week, do something positive about it. Sign our petition calling on the Premier to bring in lockdown amnesty. That's what we're calling it. And while you're on that website, feel free to chip in to support our journalism and our advocacy. Megan Grant is bought and paid for by Justin Trudeau, and it shows. Rebel News is supported only by our viewers. We don't take a dime from any government. And it shows, doesn't it? Thanks for your support. Go to lockdownamnesty.com to see the CBC's email to me, my entire letter to the Premier from last fall, and to sign the petition to call off these lockdown prosecutions. And if you really want to make the CBC furious, feel free to chip in a few bucks to support our citizen journalism too. Thanks very much.